The meeting room at Forrester Creations had been designed to project control, power, and certainty, but on that day, all three felt like illusions barely held together. The long, polished table reflected the anxious faces of executives who were no longer discussing strategy with confidence, but circling around it, searching for direction in a company that had begun to feel unstable beneath its own legacy. The conversation moved in careful, measured tones, each voice trying to assert clarity, yet none able to fully disguise the growing unease that lingered beneath the surface. It was not just about numbers or creative direction anymore. It was about fractures within the company, within the family that defined it, within the fragile alliances that had kept everything from falling apart. And then the door opened. Not with the quiet restraint expected in that room, but with urgency, with force, with something so raw that it cut through every word still hanging in the air. The sudden sound silenced the discussion instantly, all attention snapping toward the entrance as Thomas stepped inside, his presence shattering the carefully maintained illusion of control. He was not the composed, determined figure they had come to recognize in recent months. There was no confidence in his posture, no calculated expression in his eyes. Instead, there was something far more unsettling: panic, unfiltered and undeniable. In his arms, Douglas lay unnaturally still. The contrast was immediate and devastating. Thomas's rigid frame, held together by sheer will, against the small, fragile body he carried so tightly, as though letting go for even a second would cause everything to unravel completely. Douglas's face was pale, his features drawn, his usual brightness replaced by a stillness that felt wrong, deeply wrong. The room, moments ago filled with tension, now seemed to collapse inward, the air thick with something heavier than silence. Thomas did not speak immediately. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he could not. His eyes moved across the room until they found Ridge, and in that instant, something passed between them. Not words, not understanding, but recognition. Recognition of fear, of something beyond control. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was not the voice of a man trying to convince, manipulate, or justify. It was unsteady, breaking under the weight of what he was saying, each word pulled from a place that had no room for calculation. Douglas was sick. Not just unwell, not something that could be dismissed or managed quietly. Something far worse. Something that carried a finality they were not ready to face. The word itself seemed to echo in the room, settling into every corner, refusing to be ignored. It did not belong there, not in that space, not attached to someone so young, so full of life only days before. And yet, there it was, undeniable, irreversible in the way it changed everything the moment it was spoken. Ridge did not react immediately. For a fraction of a second, he remained still, his expression unreadable, as though his mind had refused to process what he had just heard. But beneath that stillness, something fractured. The past rose up without warning, memories of Thomas's deception, the lies, the manipulations that had once seemed so convincing until they collapsed under their own weight. That history did not disappear simply because the situation had changed. It lingered, pressing against his instincts, forcing him to question even now, even in a moment that demanded belief. But then he looked at Douglas, and everything else fell away. There was no performance in the child's condition, no possibility of fabrication in the way his small body seemed to shrink into Thomas's arms, in the unnatural stillness that replaced his usual restless energy. This was not something that could be staged. Not something that could be manipulated into existence. This was real. And the realization hit Ridge with a force that left no room for doubt. Thomas stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and for the first time, there was no barrier between father and son.
No tensión, no resentment.
Only fear, shared and overwhelming. The kind that stripped everything else away, leaving behind only what mattered most. Hope entered at that exact moment. She had not expected this. She had come prepared for another conversation, another difficult discussion about the company, about Thomas, about the constant balancing act between past wounds and present responsibilities. But what she saw as she stepped into that room stopped her completely, her breath catching before she could even fully understand why. Then she saw Douglas. The world narrowed instantly. Everything else, the room, the people, the tension, disappeared as her focus locked onto him. The way he looked, the way he did not move, the way something essential seemed to be missing from him, it all registered at once, too quickly, too intensely for her to process in any measured way. She moved without thinking. Crossing the space between them in seconds, she reached for him, her hands trembling as she pulled him close, as if physical contact alone could anchor him, could bring him back to the vibrant, joyful child she knew. Her heart pounded against her chest, each beat louder than the last, as fear settled into her in a way that left no room for denial. This was not something she could fix, not something she could shield him from, and the realization tore through her with brutal clarity. At the edge of the doorway, Liam stood frozen. He had followed Hope, not out of certainty, but out of instinct, sensing that something was wrong before he even knew what it was. But now, witnessing the scene before him, he found himself unable to move forward, unable to step into the center of a moment that felt too fragile, too devastating to disrupt. His expression shifted as understanding settled in, the complexity of his emotions reflected in the tension of his posture. There was concern, immediate and genuine, but also something deeper, something tied to the history that had brought them all to this point. The fractures, the betrayals, the choices that had shaped their relationships, it all remained, even now, even in the face of something far greater. Because tragedy did not erase the past. It only forced them to confront it in a different way. Ridge finally moved. His voice, when it came, was steady, but only just, held together by necessity rather than certainty. He reached for his phone, his actions driven by instinct, by the need to do something, anything, that could shift the situation away from this unbearable stillness. The call to the hospital was immediate, urgent, leaving no room for delay.
Time mattered now.
Every second carried weight. And as the reality of that settled over them, the room that had once been filled with discussions of strategy and control now held something far more significant, the undeniable truth that everything they had been focused on just moments before no longer mattered in the face of what was happening now. News traveled quickly. Brooke did not wait for details. The moment she heard, she moved, her response immediate, driven by a force that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with instinct. Family, protection, the need to be present, to take control of a situation that felt dangerously out of control. But even as she rushed toward the hospital, something lingered beneath her urgency.
Doubt.
It was not something she wanted to feel, not in this moment, not when the situation demanded clarity and unity. But it was there, unavoidable, shaped by years of experience, by the knowledge of what Thomas had been capable of in the past. The timing, the circumstances, the suddenness of it all, it did not align neatly, did not settle easily into something she could accept without question. And yet, when she arrived, when she saw Douglas for herself, when she witnessed the fear in Hope's eyes, the desperation in Thomas's posture, the tension in Ridge's expression, that doubt began to falter. Because this was not something that could be fabricated. Not this. Not like this. The hospital became the center of everything. The place where fear, hope, and uncertainty converged into something almost unbearable. The sterile environment, the quiet efficiency of the staff, the constant movement of doctors and nurses, it all created a sense of urgency that left no space for denial, no room to escape the reality of what was happening. Tests were ordered, evaluations conducted, every step moving them closer to confirmation, to a truth that none of them were ready to face but could no longer avoid. And as they waited, as the hours stretched into something indistinct and heavy, the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had said and done to each other, began to shift. Because in the face of this, those things felt smaller. Not unimportant, but distant. What remained was the present moment, and the child at the center of it. Thomas sat alone for a brief moment, separated from the others, his hands still trembling, his mind replaying everything that had led to this point. For once, there was no defense, no justification, no attempt to reshape the narrative in his favor. There was only truth, and the unbearable realization that nothing he had done in the past could prepare him for this. Across the room, Hope held on to Douglas, her fear refusing to loosen its grip, her thoughts spiraling between what she knew and what she could not yet accept. She wanted to be strong, to be steady, to be what Douglas needed in that moment, but the uncertainty threatened to break through, to overwhelm her completely. Liam watched from a distance, his presence quiet but constant, his concern unwavering despite the complexity of his emotions. Whatever existed between them, whatever history they carried, none of it mattered now in the way it once had, because this was bigger than all of them. And as the doctors finally approached, their expressions carefully composed but impossible to fully read, one truth settled over the room with quiet, devastating clarity. Everything was about to change, not in the gradual, manageable way they were used to, but in an instant. And nothing would ever be the same again. The Forrester mansion had rarely felt so luminous, so carefully arranged to hold not only beauty, but the fragile promise of redemption. Every detail of the ceremony reflected intention, from the soft cascade of white florals lining the aisle to the warm glow of light that seemed to soften even the sharpest memories. It was not just a wedding. It was a declaration, a collective hope that something broken could finally be made whole again. For Thomas, it was more than a new beginning. It was a final chance, perhaps the last, to prove that he was no longer the man defined by deception, obsession, and control. For Hope, it was a leap of faith that required her to silence every doubt that had ever whispered her name in warning. And for Douglas, standing between them in a carefully chosen suit, it was the promise of a family that felt complete, stable, and real. The guests watched with a mixture of tenderness and quiet apprehension. No one present could fully separate this moment from the past that haunted it. Too much had happened, too many wounds had been inflicted, and only partially healed. Yet the scene unfolding before them seemed to demand belief. Thomas stood at the altar with a stillness that was almost reverent, his eyes fixed on Hope with a depth of emotion that felt stripped of pretense. There was no calculation in his expression, no trace of the manipulative edge that had once defined him. Instead, there was something raw, almost fragile, as though he understood that everything rested on what happened in this moment. Hope, walking toward him, carried her own quiet storm. Her steps were steady, her posture composed, but inside, her thoughts moved in relentless circles. She wanted to believe in this version of Thomas, the one who had shown patience, restraint, and a genuine desire to change. She wanted to believe that love could exist without shadows, without the constant threat of something darker waiting beneath the surface. When they finally stood together, the world seemed to narrow around them. The ceremony unfolded with a quiet intensity, each word spoken carrying more weight than tradition alone could justify. Their vows were not simple declarations. They were confessions of everything they had endured, everything they had risked to reach this point. Thomas spoke with a voice that trembled not from uncertainty, but from the magnitude of what he was promising. He spoke of Douglas, of the responsibility he carried not only as a father, but as a man who had once nearly destroyed everything he now cherished. He spoke of Hope, of the way she had challenged him to become something better, not through force, but through belief. Hope listened, her heart pulled between the sincerity in his words and the echoes of a past she could never fully erase. When it was her turn, her voice carried both strength and vulnerability, a careful balance that reflected her internal struggle. She spoke of forgiveness, of the courage it took to trust again, of the possibility that love could survive even the deepest fractures. For a moment, it seemed as though the past had been quieted. Then the door opened. The sound was not loud, but it cut through the ceremony with a precision that felt almost deliberate. Every head turned at once, the collective focus shifting toward the entrance, as if pulled by an unseen force. What followed was not immediate chaos, but something far more unsettling, a stillness, sharp and absolute, as the figure in the doorway stepped forward into the light. Caroline. The recognition did not come all at once. It moved through the room in waves, disbelief first, then confusion, then something closer to horror as the impossible became undeniable. She was not a memory, not a shadow of the past. She was real, present, her expression marked by something that could not be mistaken for illusion. The air seemed to thin as she moved forward, each step measured, each movement carrying the weight of years that had been hidden, buried, denied. Hope felt it before she understood it. A shift so sudden, so profound, that it stole the breath from her lungs. Her gaze moved from Caroline to Thomas, searching for something, an explanation, a denial, anything that could anchor her to reality. But Thomas stood frozen, his composure shattered in an instant, his silence louder than any confession. Caroline's voice broke the stillness. It did not rise. It did not need to. Every word landed with devastating clarity, unraveling the illusion that had been so carefully constructed. She was alive.
She had always been alive.
And the life she had been forced to live in secrecy was not the result of circumstance or tragedy, but design. A design orchestrated by the man standing at the altar, the man who had just pledged his love and honesty before everyone present. The room reacted, but the reactions were distant, muted, as if happening in another space entirely. For Hope, everything narrowed into a single, unbearable point of focus. Thomas, the man she had chosen to trust again, the man she had believed could be different. Her body moved before her mind could fully process the truth. A step back, instinctive, protective, as though distance alone could shield her from the realization taking shape inside her. Her eyes searched his face, desperate for contradiction, for anything that could dismantle what she was hearing. But there was nothing there to hold on to.
No denial.
No immediate defense. Only a stunned silence that spoke more clearly than words ever could. Caroline continued, her composure fragile but unbroken. She did not speak with anger alone. There was pain in her voice, deep and enduring, shaped by years of isolation and fear. She spoke of being forced into silence, of being hidden away under the guise of protection, of the manipulation that had turned her life into something unrecognizable. She spoke of Douglas, of the child she had been separated from, of the years she had lost watching from a distance, unable to claim her own son. At the mention of his name, Douglas moved. It was not hesitation that guided him, but instinct. He broke away from the stillness, from the confusion, from the structure of the ceremony that had once centered him, and ran toward Caroline. The moment they collided was not graceful. It was desperate, emotional, overwhelming in its sincerity. His small arms wrapped around her with a force that carried every unanswered question, every moment of absence he had not fully understood until now. Caroline held him just as tightly, her composure finally fracturing as tears fell freely, the reality of their reunion too powerful to contain. Hope watched, and something inside her shifted irreversibly. This was no longer about doubt, no longer about uncertainty. This was truth. And it was devastating. She turned back to Thomas, her voice trembling not from weakness, but from the sheer force of what she was trying to contain. The questions came, not in a rush, but with a careful intensity that made each one feel heavier than the last. She needed to hear it from him, needed him to say something that could either confirm or deny the reality unfolding before her. But even as she asked, a part of her already knew the answer. Because his silence had already spoken. Ridge stepped forward, his presence commanding but shaken. The weight of what he was witnessing settled heavily on him, not just as a father, but as a man who had spent years trying to believe that his son could change. His mind moved rapidly, trying to reconcile the Thomas he had defended, the Thomas he had trusted, with the accusations now being laid bare in front of him. His voice, when it came, was firm, demanding, but beneath it was something far more fragile. Steffi stood beside him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. She had fought for Thomas, had believed in his growth, had defended him against those who refused to see anything beyond his past. But now, faced with this, she found herself standing on uncertain ground, the certainty she had clung to beginning to crack. The room that had once held hope now held something entirely different: collapse. Thomas remained where he was, unmoving, as if the weight of everything had pinned him in place. His thoughts did not come in clear sequences. They collided, fragmented, overwhelming in their intensity. The life he had built, the progress he had fought for, the belief he had finally begun to earn, it all unraveled in an instant, leaving behind the truth he had tried so desperately to bury. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words did not come, because there were no words that could undo this. No explanation that could justify what had been done. And in that silence, as the eyes of everyone he had ever loved or hurt remained fixed on him, one undeniable reality took hold. This was not just the end of a wedding. It was the complete collapse of everything he had tried to become. And as the moment stretched, heavy and inescapable, Thomas stood alone at the center of it, facing the consequences he could no longer outrun, knowing that whatever came next...